Okay, day 3 and probably the final day of the Lexemba speedrun. To be honest, my head is still kind of reeling from the last episode. I managed to thoroughly confuse myself and I started thinking round in circles, and I ended up giving myself a bit of a headache. But there's nothing for it other than to just soldier on. That's how this speedrun works. No breaks, no example sentences, no mercy. So let's thank the patrons for the final time this year. Hope you all have a happy new year. And now, on we go. So I was torn a bit between whether or not we were going to tackle numbers or just coin some of the other random ideas I had for words down here. But I think we are actually going to do numbers today, just because numbers really do deserve their own episode, whereas all these random words here, I could just coin those anytime, or we could just save them for future episodes. Whereas with numbers, there's actually a surprising amount of stuff that we need to cover, and that needs to be actually explained on air. So, kind of like with colours, I've never really cared very much about number systems. I've never been a big fan of numbers in general. The most exotic thing I've ever done with numbers was just decide to make the Thracian languages have a base 12 system, and I did that because I wanted Naqshti to be a sort of prestige language when it comes to science and mathematics. And mathematicians are fond of saying that base 12 is like the optimal base for calculations, so most of the Thracian languages have a base 12 system. And in fact, that's probably the best place to start, is thinking about what kind of base we're working with. And honestly, I think we're just going to stick with base 10, because if you look at the data, like according to Walls, significantly more than half of the world's languages use a pure decimal system, and I really don't see the need to do anything more extravagant than that. The only other option that kind of catches my eye is the hybrid vigesimal decimal system, but I don't think I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one is I just honestly can't really be bothered. Again, I just don't really care enough about numbers to throw in extra complexity just for the hell of it. Also, there are several European languages that have a system like that, and one of which is actually Basque, and the verb system in Takvamir was pretty directly inspired by Basque, so I don't want to pull anything else that would be overtly similar to Basque. And also, I don't know how much I want to get into this now, but there is going to be another language in the same world as Takvamir that I have some very particular ideas for, which we might get to if, when we finish this language, you all want to see a season 2. But I'm envisioning this other language as being something of a prestige language, and so I was thinking maybe what could happen is that Takvamir has its own native number system, but then in academic or just general formal contexts, they use a number system that they borrow from this other language. Which does happen occasionally. Like, I think in Korean, and possibly some of the other Southeast Asian languages, they have their own native numbers, but then they have like a parallel series of Chinese numbers. But for this other language, I am strongly considering giving it a vigesimal system, for reasons that we will get into when the time comes. So I don't want to have too much vigesimality going on. So, pretty certain we're going with pure base 10. Now, something that occurred to me last night, actually. Do our numbers need to agree in gender with the nouns that they go with? Because I can see two possibilities. One, numerals are considered adjectives and therefore are expected to behave as adjectives, and will therefore agree. Or, numbers are considered some sort of general quantifier, and so the nouns don't agree with them, they need to occur in some specific form, like, for example, the genitive. So, if you say, like, 5 apples, then that would be like 5 of apple, which reminds me a bit of Russian, because I don't know much about Russian, but I do know about Russian numerals, because I remember reading this like 10 years ago, and it absolutely just baffling me. But in Russian, if you are enumerating something, if there is a numeral and a noun, if the numeral is 1, or it just has a 1 in the ones place, so like 1, I'm not actually sure about 11, that might be different, but 21, 71, 101, doesn't matter. If the numeral is 1, then the noun that it goes with has to be in the nominative singular. As far as I understand, regardless of the role that the noun is playing in the sentence, it must be in the nominative singular. Whereas if it's 2, 3, or 4 of the noun, then it has to be in the genitive singular. And if it's more than 4, then it's in the genitive plural. So it's like 1 book, 2, 3, or 4 of book, 5 of books. Now, I have no idea why that happens, why the plural is only used for numerals greater than 4, but the point is we could have a specific case, like the genitive, that nouns are expected to occur in when they are being counted. And that brings me to the other thing. We already have a word for 1 and a word for 2, because the word for 1 is giving us our singulative, and the word for 2 is giving us the dual. Unless we wanted to finagle things a little bit and say that the singular ending is actually just some sort of generic indefinite, and maybe the dual ending could be a word for like pair or twin or something. But for now, let's just run with this idea that we do in fact have a word for 1 and 2. Now, we had decided beforehand that numerals do not agree in number with the nouns they modify. And we did that because the dual here is built off of the singular stem, not the plural stem. So kind of like in Turkish, anytime you have a number with a noun, it's unnecessary to put a plural on the noun because you already know exactly how many the noun is. So 1 dog, 2 dog, 3 dog, 4 dog, etc. But since in the proto-lang, the singular and plural of the different noun classes actually came from different classifiers, back in the day, number agreement would effectively be the same as case agreement. So it would be kind of weird if numbers agreed in class but not number. And then we have the issue of, if the word that gives rise to the dual suffix means 2, and if we say that numbers do need to agree in class, then we need to put the class endings on all of the dual forms as well. So both the noun stem, which is the singular, will have the class marker, but the same class marker will also come after the dual ending. It reminds me a little bit of Old Norse definite marking, because in Old Norse, definiteness is marked by a specific suffix, but that suffix evolved from an old demonstrative, I believe, which needed to agree with the noun in case. So when you make something definite in Old Norse, you need to change the ending of the stem of the noun, then attach the definite marker, and then change that in the same way, so you get this weird kind of double marking for case. So if we did that here, then we would have to go through and change all of these dual forms. Now the human class would actually be unaffected, because the human singular ending is just a W, which would assimilate straight into the U of the old dual ending. So these would all be completely unchanged. But in the animate, if we stick the animate class ending at the end of the dual marker, that would act to lower the final vowel. So we'd need to change all of these, which isn't a huge problem, but it would mean that in the nominative, we would effectively, as far as I can immediately tell, we would always lose the distinction between the singular and dual. They would always look identical. So the dual for animates would only exist in the non-nominative cases. Alternatively, if we say that the dual marker just came from an old word that meant pair or something similar, just a generic word that meant 2 of something that wasn't actually technically a numeral, would it still need to agree? I guess it would. You say a pair of cows, it's an animate pair of cows. I'm trying to think if there's any way to not have the endings change. The only thing I can think of is if the word that gave rise to the dual was inherently inanimate. Like, for example, if it came from a verb that means to join. So with the inanimate ending to nominalize it, that would mean like a joining. Like 2 things that have been twinned together. And that would necessarily have to be in the inanimate. Because if it was in the animate, then that would mean like a joining animal. Like an animal that joins other things. That's a tricky one, because that feels a bit contrived. That is something that I'm just going to have to think about later. But it does bring up another issue, actually. I'm sure we have at least briefly mentioned this at some point before, but we made both the dual and the singulative suffixes, which, if they come from numerals, implies that the numeral comes after the noun. Or at least it suggests that that might be the case. Because, like, it's reasonably common to use a word that means 1 or something as just a sort of generic, not just nominalizing element, but a sort of dummy suffix in a way. Like you can say, like, the red one. But even then, saying that out loud, actually, I don't know if that would make sense here. It's like, this is the word for house. So the singulative, it would have to be like house one, or like house thing. Again, it kind of makes sense if the noun that goes with the numeral is expected to occur in, like, the genitive, for example, because then it would be like one of house. And since this language is prototypically head final, the possessor will be expected to come first. so it's the of house 1. The problem is that that means that the singulative and the dual would have to be built off of what is the modern accusative stem rather than the nominative stem, which means we would have to redo all of the duals and all of the singulatives. And I suspect the resulting forms would be really long and clunky, so I do not want to do that. So alternatively, we could just say that numbers come after nouns, which again is a little bit weird, because since this language is head final, we would kind of expect numbers to come first. In fact, let me get the walls map. I am surprised by how tightly clustered it is. Like, with the exception of the Americas, which are a little bit of a hodgepodge, there are like these very clearly defined sort of zones. Now, interestingly, Europe is unanimously numeral noun, despite the fact that in many European languages the adjective comes after the noun. It's interesting that Hawaiian is numeral noun as well. So it seems like numerals don't have to follow the order that you would expect based on head directionality. I was actually going to bring this up in a bit, but Walls actually mentions it here. So in Egyptian Arabic, the numerals 1 and 2 follow the noun, while higher numbers precede the noun, which would be awfully convenient for our system to do, if it just so happened that 1 and 2 were the only numbers that came after the noun, so we could get our singulative and dual. Now, one thing that I would prefer, if possible, is if the dual ending was not recognizably similar to the numeral for 2. Because if the word for 2 is just li, then that's just indistinguishable from just the noun followed by a numeral, other than the occasional phonological process that occurs at the interface of the two. But I'd prefer them to be a little bit more distinct than that. I mean, it's not uncommon for languages to have multiple words for some of the lower numbers, like 1 and 2. Like in Mandarin, you've got R, which is like the standard word for 2, but then you also have liang, and I still don't know what the rule is for when you're supposed to use one or the other. So one idea that I just had is that the singulative could come from some old generic word that was used in counting, something like grain or piece or something, and so it would originally have been used in the same way that in English we say like a grain of rice, or blade of grass, or drop of water, as just a generic word that could be used for all of those things, and then it just got extended out into all inanimate nouns. And if that were the case, I do not think it would need to be built off of the accusative. I'm wondering if it's worth doing a split, where some numerals come after the noun and some come before. At this point, I'm just thinking maybe like the digits 1 to 9 would come after the noun, and maybe the word for 10 could come from some sort of quantifier or counting noun, like in Nahuatl, and I think Mayan as well. A lot of the larger words in the multiples of 20 come from specific nouns, so like the root that you use for multiples of 20 is bowali, which is a nominalized form of the verb that means to count. So 20 is sempowali, which is 1 count. 40 is umpowali, which is 2 counts, etc. But then when you get to 400, the root is tsontli, which means head of hair. So it's like as large a number as you have hairs on your head. And then when you get to 8,000, the root is shikipilli, which is a bag full of cacao beans. So, if we had some numerals that come from nouns of that nature, then those I could imagine being rendered as a possessive phrase, and therefore they would come before the noun, and they would assign the genitive. Or in fact, wait a second, if it's a possessive phrase, are we going to have to invent another possessive classifier? Is there going to be a possessive classifier specifically for quantities? Hold on, let me think about this. So if you wanted to say something like 10 people, in fact, let's go bigger than that. Let's just say 100 people. And just for the sake of example, let's just steal the Nahuatl and just say that the word for 100 comes from a word that means a head full of hair. How would you express that with a possessive classifier? I'm not sure which one would actually be the one that's relativized, because you could either say, like, I see the people that a head of hair comprises, or represents, or enumerates, something like that. Or, I see the head of hair that people comprise. That's a weird one. I don't know if it's my English bias, but I really want to throw a passive in there. I want to say, like, I see the head of hair that is comprised of people. But that wouldn't work because there is no way of doing a passive with the way our classifiers are working. You could also say, I see the people who comprise a head of hair, but that would work differently than all the other classifiers, because the head of hair would be the object of the relative clause, not the subject, which is not what we want. Something tells me that for a lot of situations with numerals, it wouldn't really be necessary to use a classifier, which is ironic considering that one of the most common kinds of classifier systems in the world is numeral classifiers. But it just seems to me that like most of the time you would be able to get across a meaning of, I see 100 people, without needing to say, I see the 100 that people comprise. Now, if numbers were marked for class, then that feels slightly more natural to me that it would come at the head of the relative clause. Because if it's not just a word that means 100, but it specifically means 100 people, or 100 animate things, or 100 inanimate things, then you could say, I saw the 100 animate things that dogs comprised. Okay, so I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around this, but if we have at least some numerals that are derived from quantitative nouns, which are used in a possessive construction, since in this language, possessors come before their possessees, then that means that those numerals will come after the noun. Because if you wanted to say like 10 people, it would be 10 of people, which would be of people 10. So those numerals would come afterwards. But if we had other numerals that behaved more like typical adjectives, we would expect them to come beforehand and behave just like typical adjectives, where they need to agree in class, number, and case. That's kind of a fun split. Okay, let me think about this for a second. Now, it occurs to me that in a lot of languages, the word for 5 is related to the word for hand, obviously because the human hand has 5 fingers. Now, that is a very obvious source of a noun-like numeral. It makes me think of Nahuatl, because the word for 5 in Nahuatl is maquili, which is the incorporated form of the word hand, plus the nominalized form of the verb that means to take. So it's like one handful. And then the word for 10 is matlactli, which again has the ma element meaning hand. And the tlactli I can't actually remember, but I'm pretty sure it means something along the lines of holding with both hands. And in fact, that gives me an idea. Could our word for 10 be the word for 5 in the dual? Literally just a pair of 5s. It feels like we're getting dangerously close to a base 5 system at that point. Because I was going to say, Nahuatl also has a sub-base of 5, where the numbers from 6 to 9 are literally 5 plus 1, 5 plus 2, 5 plus 3, and 5 plus 4. So could we do base 10 with a sub-base of 5? Well, if we did that, and if every numeral above 5 was based on the word for hand, then that would mean that numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 would come before the noun, and all other numbers would come afterwards. Or if we didn't do that, and just said that 5 is based on the word for hand, and maybe 10 as well, but 6, 7, 8, and 9 were just their own words, then that would mean that multiples of 5, specifically, would have to come after the noun, which feels really weird. Honestly, I'm kind of toying around the idea of putting a vigesimal system back on the table, because again, I was thinking of saving vigesimal for the other language, and in fact, specifically, I might as well say now, I was thinking of having a very Nahuatl-esque system, where it's base 20 with the sub-base of 5. 5 is based on hand, just because I just think it's a very neat system, and it would work well thematically for what I have planned for the rest of the language. But with this, it feels kind of weird. I don't know enough about numbers to know why, but it feels weird to me to do base 10 with a sub-base of 5. I'm sure there's natural precedent for it, but just something about it is just kind of rubbing me the wrong way. So our options are basically base 10 with sub-base 5, with 5 based on hand, so that every number 5 or above would need to come after the noun, as part of a possessive construction, whereas 1, 2, and 3 would have to come beforehand. Option 2, Nahuatl-style vigesimal with sub-base of 5, which would have exactly the same effect of having the numerals 1 to 4 come before the noun, and all other numerals come afterwards. It would just feel more mathematically sound for reasons that I can't explain. Or option 3, say that the word for 5 is not related to the word for hand, and pick some other numerals to act as nouns, like maybe 10 or 100 or something. I should say, by the way, that the other language is not related to Takvamir. It's from a completely different language family, although it's conceivable that they would exist in close enough geographic proximity that there could be some aerial effects going on, so maybe they have a similar number system because of that? Now, while we're on the subject, I might as well bring this up here. With a base 20 system with a subbase of 5, that would mean that we would also need a unique word for 15, which in Nahuatl is kastolli, and I do not know what it's related to. And apparently neither does anyone else. Which actually kind of reminds me of Manchu, because in Manchu you've got a pretty regular base 10 system. You've got your digits from 1 to 9, then there's this word for 10, and then after that, you just add a digit after the word for 10. So 11 is 10-1, 12 is 10-2, 13 is 10-3, 14 is 10-4, but then you get to 15, and it's got this completely different word, tofochon. Like, where did that come from? But then for 16, we go back to being 10-6, 17 is 10-7, so it's just this one completely random word thrown in there. Why does 15 have to be the one that breaks the pattern? I cannot immediately find where that comes from, so I'll have to look into that later. Okay, I'm having a lot of trouble deciding, so I think it might help to consider some of the implications that these different options would have. If a number is a true adjective, then it will come before the noun it's modifying and take the full spectrum of agreement. Whereas if it comes from a noun, the noun will be placed in the genitive, or what was the genitive, which is now the accusative, whereas the number would come afterwards, its class would be inherent, and it would take the case of whatever role it filled in the sentence. Now, what happens if we had both? If, just for the sake of argument, the word for 5 is based on the word for noun, and is therefore noun-like, and if the words for 6 to 9 are based off the word for 5, then to say 7, it would be like 5 and 2. So the 5 would come after the noun, but then what about the 2? Could just have a word that means and, so it would be like, of dogs 5 and 2. Alternatively, it could be like 2 more than 5, or 2 beyond 5, or 2 over 5, in which case the 5 would not take the usual case marking. It would be marked in the locative, and then there would be the postposition that means over, or some such thing. Now, would the word for 2 come after that, or before the 5? I think the expectation in a fully head final system would be that it would come at the end, because the over 5 is like a modifying phrase. So I guess the 2 would be the possessee in this phrase, so whereas the 5 would have to be in the locative to go with the postposition, the 2 is the one that takes the case, and in this specific instance, it acts as a noun. But it does feel kind of weird to have the possessor and the possessee interrupted by this postpositional phrase, but it also feels kind of weird to split the number up. Especially for low numbers like 1 to 10, it would feel kind of weird to split those apart. I think maybe early on, a number like 7 could just be formed with like 5 and 2, and they just kind of get stuck together. Whereas for a higher number, like say 100, this is 102, I think actually in this case, 2 would just continue to act like a regular adjective. So it would just be the same as 2 dogs, but with this extra preceding phrase that means over 100. So that means any time any of the adjective-like numerals are used, even if there's also a noun-like numeral in the same construction, they need to precede the noun. So again, it's kind of like Russian, where the case that you use is determined specifically by the number that's in the ones place. So 1, 21, 31, 71, all take the nominative singular. Now, I like this option with the postposition more than I do this one with the word and. So if we go with this one, then thinking about what numerals are likely to come from nouns, if we go with the hand idea, then that means that any number with 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the ones place will come before the noun, and the remainder will come afterwards. Whereas if we say that 5 doesn't come from hand, then that means the only noun-like numerals that we'd have would be, I'd imagine, multiples of 10. So that means that numbers would only come after the noun if they were multiples of 10. I'm starting to prefer the hand idea, to be honest. Now, if the word for, say, 7 is based on an old phrase that means something like a hand and 2, and let's say we're counting dogs, so a hand and 2 of dogs, but hand needs to take case marking. So what do we do with the and 2? Either we say that this compound or phrase is so old that the and 2 bit has got stuck on the end and people have essentially forgotten that it's a compound, and so case marking can come at the end of that. But if that's the case, then I don't think it would be seen as a possessive phrase. Alternatively, it could be 2 and hand, maybe we should go for base 20. I really don't know. Because having 1, 2, 3, and 4 come before the noun, and all other numbers come afterwards, is so much more unique and interesting than just saying that, like, multiples of 10, if even that, come after the noun. You know, at the top of the episode, I was pretty adamant that we were going to stick with a base 10, but the more we do this, the more I'm convincing myself that maybe vigesimal is the way to go. Okay, while I dwell on that some more, there's some other things that we should bring up while I remember. So obviously we're going to have cardinal numbers, just the standard numbers that are used in counting, and we're going to have ordinal numbers, first, second, third, etc. But I was thinking of doing something that, to my memory, I don't think I've actually done before. Again, I usually don't go into that much depth with number systems. Distributive numbers. And I think Walls actually has a good example to explain what distributive numbers are. So like in this sentence, John and Bill carried 3 suitcases. Does that mean that John and Bill carried 3 suitcases in total? Or both John and Bill separately carried 3 suitcases, so that there were 6 suitcases in total? And so a lot of languages will have separate forms for each of their numerals to indicate that they are distributive. So like in this example from Georgian, where sam sami means 3 each. And that's an example of one of the ways that you can form distributive numerals. In fact, by far the most common way is through reduplication. So we've established that this language has reduplication in some contexts, so I think that might be fun to do here as well. And then I was thinking of also having some adverbial numbers, which would be the equivalent of English's once, twice, thrice, and for some reason English dropped all the ones above that. But there are languages that have the equivalent of that sequence extending indefinitely. So like in Nahuatl, there's this specific suffix that you can put on a numeral, and it means that many times. And in Latin, they have a whole series of numbers for this. In fact, numerals in Latin, I remember, have a lot of different forms. Yeah, have a look at this. You've got your cardinal numbers, and your ordinal numbers, but then you've got this special suffix that you can affix to the ordinal numbers, which produces, like, fractions. But then you've got a special class of nouns that are declined as plural even though they have a singular meaning, and they get their own numbers. Then you've got your distributive numerals, and you can attach the same suffix from before to a distributive numeral to mean of however many parts, of 2 parts, of 3 parts, of 4 parts. Then you've got your adverbial numbers, but then you've got your multiplicative numbers, which are different from your distributive numbers, because they mean single, double, triple. And then you have proportional numbers, so like twice as great, which I assume means twice as much, or 3 times as much. So yeah, Latin really went all in with the numerals for some reason. Now, I think I'm going to save that kind of complexity for the other language. I think having this relatively simple set is good. Now, for the adverbial one, so this is basically going to be synonymous with the number of times that something happens. And not too long ago, we actually came up with a word for time, because we used it here in our word for when. This old word acha would have been a very old word that meant time or instance or something like that. So when is what time. So, for the adverbials, we could just stick that at the end of the numeral. And ordinals, what I pretty much always do is come up with a word that means rank or degree or something like that. First would be rank 1, second would be rank 2, etc., which is exactly what Mandarin does with D, because you've had DE, DR, D-San, etc. Now, would these behave any differently than what we established up here? Well, I'm pretty sure the rank would be a suffix, because if you're saying second, it's like the 2 rank. You know, I still don't really understand why sometimes numbers come after nouns in English. Is it just purely for disambiguation? Like, I opened this video by saying this is day 3 of Lexember, not the 3rd day of Lexember. It's kind of weird. But you do that in Mandarin too, because with the D construction, it's rank 1, even though it's a head final language. So you'd think it would be the 1 rank. I really don't know. In any case, rank, or the equivalent word, will probably be a noun. We could say that it just gets affixed on early enough in history that it just becomes interpreted essentially as, like, an adjectival suffix, and therefore ordinals will have to agree in case, number, and gender just like other numerals. Or we can say that since it's a noun, it has to be in a possessive construction. So something like first place would be the 1 rank of place. Or actually, it could be place of first rank, which would be weird because that would follow the opposite pattern of other numerals. If we scrapped the idea that some numerals would come from nouns, I'm not necessarily going to do this, but if we were to just say that all numerals were just inherently adjectives, then that would mean that turning them into ordinals with the word rank could be essentially a nominalization strategy, which would make them available for the possessive construction, which would mean that all cardinals would come before the noun, and all ordinals would come after the noun. That's interesting. Again, don't think I'm necessarily going to do that, but it's worth noting. Now, I'm pretty sure distributive numbers would behave pretty much exactly the same as cardinals, and since the adverbial numbers are adverbial, they're definitely not going to agree in case or number with anything, and they'll be pretty free in terms of word order. I've just realized that if we say that this word rank is treated like a noun, then if we wanted to say something like the 102nd dog, then that would be either the dog of the 102nd rank, which would be the reverse pattern from other numbers, which I think would just be kind of weird. So it could alternatively be the 102nd rank of dog. So that means that once again rank would take the case marking, the noun would be in the accusative, and again we have this situation where we either have to separate the possessor and the possessee with this postpositional phrase, or we have to split up the number. And I don't really like either of those, so I am actually leaning towards the idea that the word that's giving us our ordinal suffix is old enough to be interpreted as an adjective, in which case the 2 would behave exactly the same as a cardinal. That definitely seems a lot neater. Okay, I think I need to make a proper decision at this point. So as it seems to me, the 2 options are either to stick with a base 10 system, in which all cardinal numbers are treated as adjectives, which therefore come before the noun and agree with the noun in class, number, and case, whereas ordinal nouns come afterwards, and the noun has to take the accusative. Or, option 2, we go base 20 with a sub-base of 5, and the digits 1 to 4 are the only ones that behave in the typical adjectival manner, whereas the digits 5 through 0, I guess, come after the noun and make the noun take the accusative. I have to say, the second option seems far, far more interesting. I really was going to save base 20 for the other language, but you know, even though these languages aren't related, they do exist in the same sort of cultural area. They're not immediate neighbors or anything, but their geographic and cultural separation would be, like, roughly equivalent to, like, Scandinavia and Greece, very roughly. So maybe this base 20 thing arose in this particular region very early on, and lots of unrelated languages in this area happen to have done something similar with it, which is kind of the situation with Mesoamerica anyway. So you know what? Let's go for it. This is already the weirdest and most interesting number system I've ever made, so why not embrace the weirdness? This is actually going to be a bit easier because it means we don't have to make up as many numerals. Okay, so first of all, 1. It's a good place to start, number 1. Now we had talked about sa earlier, the root that gave rise to the singulative, but it's pretty clear at this point that that's not really congruent with the number system as we're currently envisioning it. You could maybe say that there was some weird thing where under certain circumstances the number 1 came afterwards, but the more I think about it, the more I think that the idea of it meaning just grain or piece or something makes more sense. So I think I'm actually going to scratch the idea that the singulative and the dual came from numerals. Or they came from other numerals that are so old that they've just been forgotten by this point. Which means we might have to retcon this word, saha, which means single or only. Gonna have to change that one. We do have a word for count, so if we were to nominalize that to get a word that means a count of something, which I'm thinking might be the word for 10 or 20, hopefully not ripping off Nahuatl too much, then with the inanimate ending there, and just going through the sound changes, that would ultimately come out as just hor. I don't think we have a word for hand yet. No, we don't. And we do have this word vak, which means on top of, above, or over. So 102 could be 2 above 100, or I guess above 400 since we're in base 20 now. But there is also this word min, which is beyond or past. Both of those could be doable. Just looking through my list of various different forms I've accumulated over the years, seeing which ones I like. I'm thinking the numerals 1 to 4 will need to be pretty short, 1 or 2 syllables at most. Then again, I am consistently surprised by how long numerals can be in some languages. Like I remember in Inuktitut, they're crazy long. Yeah, like look at this. The number 7 in Inuktitut is Tisa mau jungigaktut. It's like 7 syllables. And that's just for the number 7. I looked through the etymologies of these not too long ago, and I can't remember specifically, but they all come from quite complex Proto-Inuit phrases that apparently have been maintained as these quite large numerals. But I don't think we're going to have anything quite that long. Of course, we have to ask ourselves, with these compound numerals that are based off of the word for 5, does vowel harmony apply? And I think the answer is yes. I think these numbers will have been formed long enough ago that they would have been seen as discrete and individual words before vowel harmony kicked in. So in that case, which element controls the harmony? Because it's not like a compound, or like any affixation is happening. We've got what is effectively a conjunction coming between them, like 2 and 5. I guess if it just gets fossilized early enough, it will just be the initial vowel. So like if our proto-word for hand was like watu, then as an independent word, and as the word for 5, then by the modern language that would become vat. But as it gets compounded onto the other numerals, the W will most often disappear. How obvious do we want it to be that the system has a subbase of 5? Or specifically, how obvious do we want the word hand to be in the system? Because outside the word for 5, we could have it erode down to just like a very simple suffix with just like one consonant or something. Of course, the word for 5 is going to be an animate noun, so it's going to need the animate class suffix. And it will always be animate. It does not change to agree in class with the noun that it's modifying. And that means that the word for 5 is necessarily going to end in a vowel. And we have to keep in mind that for numbers 6 to 9, the word for hand does need to be preceded by some little word that means and. Now I did have on the list of things to talk about, we do need to discuss coordination at some point. So we might have to coin our word for and right here, right now. If we say that this ancient conjunction was something like me, then the I would blend in with the W and produce the E vowel, which would then get leveled by vowel harmony, which would give us this as our suffix for numerals 6 to 9. And to obfuscate things even further, we could very easily say that the consonant in that old conjunction was something that just got lost, because we have plenty of those. So that would shorten up that suffix. The only issue there is that that root, if it survives into the modern language, will just be E, which is identical to Spanish. Oh well, we'll figure that part out later. I'm just playing around with some different forms, and it's just occurred to me that only way that we can justify having numerals 6 to 9 not contain all front vowels, because the front vowel in the conjunction merges with the W in the word hand to make a long stressed E, which causes umlaut and therefore just triggers front vowels for the entire word. The only way to prevent that from happening is to say that the numeral has a uvula or some other consonant that drags vowels down. Okay, I think I am happy with these protoforms. I tried throwing in some uvulas to lower that vowel, but honestly I just didn't really like the results. I think I'm fine with keeping them consistent, and I think I'm going to order them like this. No particular reason for it, other than, for reasons that I don't really understand and don't remember very well, it's a thing in the Indo-European numeral systems where numbers that are next to each other tend to influence their initial consonant. Like in Proto-Indo-European, 4 was like quetor and 5 was penke, and in the Germanic branch, both 4 and 5 ending up having an initial F, but in Latin, somehow the initial qua from quator, 4, changed the P in penke into another qua, so it became quinque. Doesn't make any sense to me, but apparently that is a historical process that can happen. So I put the two that begin with N next to each other. Okay, we can now count to 10 in this language. Now, nidi, lim, erdi, vara, nira, nidura, limura, erdura, and then the word for 10, which we don't have. If we went with the idea that it's the dual of the word for hand, that would be ire, which just looks very similar to the ending of all the numbers that come before it. I might change that, but I'm going to leave it there for now. 15, I still don't understand how you get a separate root for it, but it is apparently a thing that can happen. I feel like I'm going to have to look into that some more before I make any firm decision about it. I might just combine the words for 5 and 10, like if 10 is based on some other word, like say to count, then 15 could be 1.5 counts. Then the question is what we do for 20. And I think in Mayan, or maybe it's a different language now, I can't remember, but I know in some language with a base 20 counting system, it means a full person, like all the digits on both hands and feet. For now, I think I'm going to say that 20 is a count, which is qor. Okay, let's do the distributive numbers next, because those should be really easy, because it's just a matter of reduplication. Of course, it depends on what pattern the reduplication follows, because it could be CV reduplication, or it could be whole word reduplication, or it could be CVC reduplication. So the word for once each could be nanao, or if we reduplicate the long vowel, it could be nanao, or it could even be nao. I'm leaning towards nanao. Two each could be ninidi, at which point we have to ask ourselves if vowel loss happens, and it becomes nindi, or if we go with CVC reduplication, say that D was also reduplicated, so it used to be nidnidi, but then the D eventually just melds with the N and becomes a geminate, ninnidi. Then if we do CVC reduplication on 3, it becomes lumlum, whereas if we don't, then that palatal L will go to a Y between vowels and then eventually just lengthen the vowel. I'm going to leave it as lumlum for now. Oh boy, how do you reduplicate erdi? Could be erderdi, because if you don't include the D, then ererdi, liquid dissimilation would happen, so it would become ereldi. So far I'm kind of feeling full reduplication. And then for 5, it depends how old these distributive numbers are, because if they're that old, then the V would not fortify in the middle of the word like that, and we get varara, which through liquid dissimilation would become varala. I don't know. I think I might just say that, in the mind of the speakers, this is still very transparent reduplication, and so to them, they'll understand that varvara is just a repetition of the word 5. It will not have become fossilized. And then for 6 through 9, we just follow the same pattern. Okay, distributive numbers done for now. Next up, also quite easy, the adverbials. Just take the protoforms and stick acha at the end. And in this case, these would be very old, I think, because this word for time is gone by the time of the modern language. Just realized I got this protoform wrong, that needs to end in an I. Not really sure what to do with the DI sequence here. Nadiach. I should become a Y. Then we get Nadiach. Feels like it shouldn't work with our phonotactics, but I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't. I think I might just call it Nadach. Actually, I'm wondering if we should preserve the vowel in the cardinal. I mean, numbers can be kind of messy. In English we have 2 and twice, and that's not even getting into the stuff that can happen with ordinals, like first and second. We'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to stick with nidich for now, add it to the list of things to think about. 6 through 9 are all easy, so then the only thing left to do today, I think, is the ordinals. You know what? I just remembered that these cardinals, at least the first 4 of them, need to inflect for gender, so I'll just quickly run through those. Okay, had to make a few alterations there, but other than that, pretty straightforward. Okay, now, for real this time, let's do ordinals. So we just need a suffix we can stick onto the protoforms, and this suffix is also going to inflect for gender. And, like I mentioned a moment ago, ordinals can sometimes be suppletive for the first couple of digits. So according to Walls, the most common situation is that 2 and upwards are related to the cardinals, but first is suppletive, presumably just because it's relatively easy for a language to come up with a word like primary, or even just like top, or something along those lines to serve as the word for first. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to 1. So we'll skip number 1 for now. Again, this root is going to be pretty old, so we can afford to do something very simple. If we just say something like B, let's just test that out. Those all look pretty good, but then we come to number 5, and I need to remind myself how this works. So 5th is hand rank. So unlike cardinals, ordinals will still inflect for gender past this point. Is that how it works? I can't really think of any other way it could work, so I'm going to go with that. Okay, and there are all our ordinals. I think that's looking pretty good. Now there's still the issue of what to do for the first ordinal, as well as for 10 and 20 and higher orders of magnitude, but that's going to have to wait for another time because I have been rambling on for absolutely ages, and by this point we have adequately generated more than enough words for Lexember, so we have accomplished what we came here to do. And so now I'm going to take the opportunity to rest and think about this a lot more once my brain has recovered. And hopefully next month I will come back to you with some insights that I've had, changes that I've made, etc. Who knows, maybe I'll completely change my mind about this whole thing. Maybe I'll decide that base 10 was the better choice after all. Who knows? We'll find out in the new year. Okay, so that's me done. Thank you very much for watching to this point. I have no idea how long this video is going to end up being. Happy holidays and Happy New Year once again, and I will see you in 2025.